So there's racism, and there's empire. And then there's also the problem of the market at home. And I mentioned, the September crash of the United States market, the stock market crash, the banking disasters, and so on and so forth. So the next factor has to do with the whole notion of neoliberalism that was associated not only with Bush, but largely with the Republican Party, to some extent the Democrats as well. But this widespread intellectual commitment to allowing the free market to rule and pulling back the state from everything except basically prisons and the military. So, anything that had to do with education, welfare, the health policy, and so on. So, enter Hurricane Katrina. So this is another part of the backstory to the kind of crisis that ultimately came about in terms of the transition of the American elite. So one of the features that was associated with the Project for a New American Century and the critics was that America, had prided itself on being able to look after its empire, but what about the home front? What about the people at home? The city of New Orleans was leveled in late August of 2005. It suffered the wrath of a natural disaster, of Hurricane Katrina. But it became clear that George Bush's neoliberalism had a lot to do with the extent of the suffering and with the way in which the disaster itself was handled. And the fact that New Orleans was largely a poor city of poor Black Americans became a visible sort of expose of the type of racial and political agenda that Bush had been talking about. So the storm was predictable. I mean, we have, advanced meteoric methods of being able to identify storms coming in. But the massive concrete and steel levees that could have curtailed the hurricane's rage were left to rot because of human action, because of cutbacks to social infrastructure. So the neoliberal policies that were responsible for state expenditures led to a tremendous amount of very visible hardship, much of which is still continuing. And so the strategy of neoliberalism was one that we're still familiar with, to give free rein to the market, to encourage privatization, to support corporate expansion. And these policies, in a certain sense, literally opened the floodgates of Hurricane Katrina. And the same policies rendered the rescue and the relief efforts, the richest country in the world, something that they could not even look after their own population. And part of this became, a very direct challenge to the question of the military strategy, because sections of the National Guard that were supposed to be for local defense were actually being used to deploy to Iraq because there was a shortage of people volunteering to work in the American Army. According to U.S. commentator and author George Packer, it was the combined effects of the failed war in Iraq and the exposed failure of neoliberalism and blatant racism of the Bush administration's management of Katrina that marked the end of the long era of this particular phase of American conservatism. So this phase of conservatism, this phenomenon, sort of came together with this kind of trifecta of racism, war, and then the big failure of neoliberalism, starting with Katrina, ending with the crisis of the stock market, around this period that created a distancing of what Karl Marx uses this word about commodities of things. He calls it fetishism. And people can say what they want about Karl Marx, but he's still really he's the critic of capitalism. If you have a problem with capitalism, Marx is really helpful. And he talked about this notion of fetishism. It literally means love. So there was there was a change in the love of the market that had been experienced around the time of this crisis. So this was the last element in the perfect storm that culminated in the November 4th, 2008 election of Barack Obama. It's an ongoing story. It's not resolved. There is renewed and continuing instability, but it indicates that there is a period of transition that in order to go forward, it had to go sideways. It had to go somewhere else. It couldn't just continue on exactly the same path of the Project for the New American Century, of the white presidents, of neoliberalism, and so on. And this is precisely what Gramsci referred to as a shift in the hegemonic block of rule. At the depths of the crisis is a very profound rethinking going on among the American elite. I'll give you an indication of this. This is a quote from the Globe and Mail, Toronto's business newspaper, about the 100th anniversary of the Harvard Business School. And it's quite interesting. Okay, the red brick Baker Library at the Harvard Business School is a shrine to U.S. capitalism. A hushed sanctuary where young managers have for 8 decades prepared for glittering careers on Wall Street and in Fortune 500 companies. But these days, it contains reminders of how fast and how far the mighty have fallen. In the lobby, stacks of brochures promote the library's valuable collection of old finance deal books. The donor, Lehman Brothers, the 160-year-old Wall Street investment bank that in September, the famous September that I talked about before, collapsed under the weight of its bad assets. In the future, Harvard business students will be looking not for genius, but for clues to the great economic crisis of 2008 and the implosion of the U.S. enterprise model. So these are pretty big ideas coming from big historic places that something needs to change. As the financial crisis continued to deepen, every sector of savings and investment value in the United States declined. It was a pretty big, rude awakening that something wasn't working. The whole idea of capitalism is to make money and to make profits, especially for big corporations. Corporations invest in the stock market melts away. No one seemed to be in control. What was happening? The Chicago School of Economics, which was led by Milton Friedman, was considered to have failed, and the ghost of John Maynard Keynes, who, a British conservative economist, certainly not, a radical, but someone who said, if we want to get the market, we also need the state, started to be resurrected. He was making a comeback out of the market madness. And this is a pretty big ideological shift, because since the mid-1970s, Keynes had been considered to be dead and irrelevant and not of any value in terms of modern contemporary economics. So, in 2008, the pendulum started to swing back towards state intervention, not without tremendous skepticism, not without a lot of reluctance and worry, and many of the old habits have continued. But there is something indicating that there's a big shift going on in the American elite about how it thinks about basic ABCs of economic policy. Back to The Economist. This is a more recent statement. 15 years ago, it seemed that the great debate about the proper size and role of the state had been resolved. Privatizing state-run companies was all the rage. The Washington Consensus reigned supreme. Persuade governments to put on the golden straitjacket and prosperity would follow. The crisis upended conventional wisdom about the relative merits of government and markets. Free marketeers such as Alan Greenspan, the former head of the Federal Reserve, have apologized for their ideological zeal.